Welcome to week 4, efficiency and optimization. The themes for today are that we can strive for efficient processes, we can devise strategies to invest in our systems to create faster and slower and therefore more efficient processes. If we want to optimize for multiple criteria, it can be very challenging. We need to know the relationship between those criteria and the overall goal. And then finally, a theme running through this is efficiencies related to the processes, and we study it to understand about those processes. Efficiency per se is not the goal. And in today, the overall presentation, I'm going to finish up and some of the discussion on scale that we had last week and review net energy. And from there, I'm going to proceed on to looking at energy efficiency and process efficiency and a couple other characteristics of energy and optimization. So last week we were talking about scale, and one of the things about scale was how we look at multiple scales and how looking at multiple scales, that is panarchy, of related scales of a problem from small, medium, and large and how they interact, was that we could look at those scales. Within one scale, we see the exploitation of a resource going to conservation, then it's released, and the reorganization. And this takes place over and over again within that scale. And if you connect these two larger scales, you end up with an interaction between small and intermediate and large and slow processes, where imagine we're studying this middle scale, but imagine something's going on like a forest. Forest is growing up and it gets to being very connected and sort of crystalline, but there's these little small disturbances that take place, and those can either help maintain the integrity of the forest and small disturbances, little fires, little windstorms, opening up pockets, making a mosaic, maintain that forest, or they can kick off the destruction of that forest and release of the energy and materials back, so they go through this reconfiguration. And when we go through that reconfiguration, those processes that do that remember things from the larger scale. There's a landscape context and historical context that feed into whatever this restructuring of that ecosystem is going to look like. Now, this is all very theoretical, I know, and I don't expect you to get that, but what I do want you to see is that by connecting this resiliency scale where there's lots of little cycles going on, that'll actually lead to the resilience, and it'll either create a mosaic of lots of disturbances or it'll lead to a reorganization process. Now, the way this relates to traps, which was one of the questions, and we talked about this a little bit last time, was that the way you avoid traps is by testing in small reversible ways and learning from that testing, making little mistakes that you can learn from instead of one large failure. So this idea of small mistakes you can learn from and readjusting is the characteristic of resilience, and choosing one method and waiting until the whole system fails, that's not resilient, that's a trap. Okay, now, an important aspect of scale is that it gives us a perspective on overall problems from large to small. And when we fail to account for scale, or we fail to account what important processes happen, it can lead to disastrous outcomes. Now, Aldo Leopold, sort of the father of modern environmental science, exhorted us to think like a mountain. That is, to have this long scale and sort of all-seeing attitude about the environment. And on long time scales, we see that civilizations may pulse with rises and falls, and if we accept that that's going to happen, then we'd be guiding the civilization in quite a different way than if we expect it always to just be linearly increasing and getting faster and more technologically sufficient with each decade. So when you look at civilizations that may pulse, there's been many studies that looked at these. The Mayans were considered to be a pulsing civilization where parts of it pop up in one part of the Central America, and then another rise of another area, another part of Central America later. And for a long period of time, the Mayan civilization was dominant through that part of the world. Italy has never really been dominant, but it has these, it waxes and wanes over centuries, if not millennia. And again, Easter Island, one of the reasons they thought that it lasted so long, one of the theories is cultural elaboration, is that when they had good times, they built statues. When they had bad times, they put that effort toward the necessary work just to keep the society going. Now, this relates to energy in society, and I want to just mention this. Like, if we have ample resources and we exploit them and grow the society, then if it's pulsing, what do we do on the decline side? How do we have a prosperous reorganization where it's prosperous and civilized instead of some sort of crash? What do we do when there's shrinking energy availability and shrinking resource availability, and we're going through a reorganization period? This is the question asked by a book by Odom and Odom called The Prosperous Way Down, and explores how we could change our energy future and yet still thrive. Now, I'm just mentioning this cultural perceptions of time. I don't want to get into this because in a way it could be sort of a little controversial and off topic for our course, but in general, in very broad sense, as studied by people that study civilizations and how they view time, Americans and Northern Europeans view time as being continuous and orderly, a focus on the near future, and really can't perceive longer-term environmental constraints. Asians, again, this is Asian cultures. Many of them have a long-looking and long historical time scale. Latin America, a lot of focus on the history and the relatives. And again, Harrison and Huntington describe how many African cultures, the honoring the ancestors actually leads to a focus on repeating the successes of the past rather than coming up with new ways to do things. So again, these are linked to the cultural perception of time and how it's difficult to look at large, these long-scale processes. You might say, well, why don't we just start thinking in terms of 10 and 100 years? Well, it's built into some of our culture, and that's going to require a cultural and political and social change, as well as good environmental science background for why that's important. On a more personal level, we have personal perceptions of time for humans are vary over a long time, and what you pay attention to at each particular time scale is very different. And so, you have to consciously try to study some particular time span in order to make that really work. And we don't really teach people to do that in our school systems and our cultures, to say, well, what's it look like? What do you think the world's going to look like 20 years from now? We might say, what type of job do you think you might have, or whatever, but these should be related discussions. And finally, there's actually brain function reasons why you think about different things at different time scales. And using FPET, which is functional positron emission tomography, they can show that people use different parts of their brains when they're asked to decide should they borrow money and repay it tomorrow or repay it in a year. They actually get different brain activity patterns, and we know from long studies that people when they think about gambling, they don't view the risks symmetrically. People are much more worried about losing than they are winning, and so they treat the same odds of winning or losing differently depending on where they're the ones holding the bank or where they're the ones gambling. So again, these are reasons why it's difficult to take that long scale view and to avoid making these questions. You might think, oh, well, we should just think about things in 10 and 20 and 50 years. Well, it's really difficult to do that for a variety of reasons. Okay, coming back to the sort of summary of what we were talking about at the end of last week with energy, which is that what we're really interested in is the net energy, and that's what's usable after all the waste energy has been subtracted, and that, the more steps you have and the more inefficient each step is along the way, then that ends up with less net energy. And today we're going to expand that to talk about what is the efficiency of one of these processes. So we're going to talk about several forms of efficiency, but the most general form is that efficiency is really the ratio of the product that we end up with over the starting material. So if you have a process that's 15% efficient, you get 15% of the product for 100% of the starting material. Now, efficiency can be low or high. It's a ratio. It's not always bad. So having this waste, the only waste in the context of this process, and we're going to see that later. So store that away. I want to talk about two types of efficiency, and one is simple process efficiency. And let's talk about it in terms of energy. Here's the total energy in to, say, the metabolism of an organism. Here's the energy that is out in some sort of usable form, such as new growth or stored in the organism. And then here's waste energy. And this simple process efficiency is just how much energy out compared to how much energy in, and you could calculate it based on the amount of energy and the waste amount of usable and the waste energy. It's a very sort of simple concept. Now, I want to expand on that to talk about overall efficiency of a process that has multiple sub-processes. This is where it gets a lot more interesting, I think. So, let's say we have a formation of a product, and it requires a certain amount of process A to take place and a certain amount of process B to take place. And the results from process A, we need 2 of those for every outcome from process B. And then those goes into the formation of the product, and we get that product out. All right. So each one of these is run by some amount of machinery. So you can imagine in a plant, this might be photosynthetic machinery, and this might be respiratory machinery. They both have to be working in parallel in order to make the product. Or it could be on an assembly line where you need 2 bumpers for every steering wheel in a car, so you've got to have twice as many of these going on as these. You can have a lot of but a lot of examples. This is just this process A, and we're going to be studying what's the rate of process A and what's the rate of process B. So the way to increase the rate of process A is have more of this machinery. The way to increase process B is have more of this machinery. And this is where we can look at a few examples of how this might relate to the overall efficiency of this process based on the amount of machinery that's involved. So there's a different definition of the overall efficiency includes the machinery that's involved. It's not just how much substrate's coming in and how much product is being made. So in this case, the overall efficiency is the rate of product formation divided by the amount of machinery A and the amount of machinery B. So let's look at sort of calculating an example here. We could have process, let's say there's 10 units of machinery A and 10 units of machinery B, and they both have the same efficiency of 50% or the rate is 0.5 times the machinery A gives us process A per unit time. So if we have 10 times 0.5, we're going to get 5 units out of process A per unit time, and same thing, 5 units out of process B if we have 10 here and the same factor. Well, if we have 5 of these, we only need 2.5 of process B. So we could do 2 things, and the overall efficiency is going to be 10 plus 10, and we're making 2.5. So the overall efficiency is 2.5 divided by 20. All right. Now, if we want to increase the overall efficiency, we could do that by either increasing the amount of A, which makes A go faster, or decrease the amount of B, which slows B down so it doesn't have this excess rate. And the reason that increases the overall efficiency is that if we're producing 5 units of A and we only need 2.5 units of B, we've got extra machinery here that is not doing anything. It's being unused. So we've got extra machinery, and that ends up being part of the denominator in this equation and decreases the amount of product. So if we double the amount of machinery here, we'd have 20 here, 10 here, and the overall rate would be 5, because we'd be using 10 units of A and 5 units of B, and that would make 5 units of the product. So what that ends up being is, with a 2-to-1 ratio. 2-to-1 ratio of A to B gives us 1 unit of product. So that's going to be 5 over 30, or 0.167 as an efficiency. Or we could leave process A at 10 and decrease this to, instead of it being at 10, it could go to 5. We'd get 10 units of A, 5 units of process B, would give us 5 units over here, and then that would give us 5 divided by, well, no, it would give us, we'd leave this would be 5, and that would give us 2.5, and so we'd have 2.5 units of product divided by 10 plus 5, or 2.5 divided by 15, and that gives us 0.167, the same efficiency. So whether we increase A or decrease B, we are going to increase the process efficiency. All right. Now, this we're going to see and discuss lots of examples in the reading of efficiency, and I want you to be able to be aware of what is a simple process efficiency, where you're just looking at how much goes in and how much goes out, and how much is a sort of the overall efficiency of all the machinery being used. And we're going to see some examples in particular next week when we start talking about accounting. We're going to be paying attention to maybe this type, how much water goes into a process compared to how much water comes out as being usable. Call that sort of embedded water in a process. Or we might be looking at this overall efficiency when we talk about cars and roads. We have all these things that are being used, and they're like the machinery in this process. When we look at the overall efficiency of how many miles, how much carbon it takes to support cars driven, we have the cars themselves, we have the fuel, we have the roads, we have the land that could have been in growing something else. All of those add up to calculating this overall footprint of a car, which is sort of the efficiency of how cars can work given the amount of CO2 that they put in the atmosphere. So those are very different ideas about how we think about efficiency. All right, now this is a good lead into talking about optimization. So optimization is really that last part we were talking about, of changing the amount of machinery so we get just the amount of rate that we need. And if we have, here's a simple optimization problem. Here's a situation where just the right amount of machinery is needed to match all the process. So the rest of all the process can only support this rate. Say here's the blue bar. But increasing the amount of machinery can support higher potential rates or lower rates. And when you compare these, if you have, in this case, not enough purple machinery, you have a lost opportunity. Your output is low because you're not meeting the opportunity of matching that up to the amount of the blue machinery. And on the other side, when you have here's the optimal ratio where they just match, just like in the example we just calculated out up above. In this case, you have excess of the purple machinery. That decreases the overall efficiency because it's just unused machinery. So This, again, is another way to represent that sort of optimization, that you're trying to match the rate of two different rates, and if you match it through balancing the amount of machinery that it takes to support those rates. Okay, back to this example that I gave here of the overall efficiency. This can also help understand why we see this this effect we call the rebound effect, and that is if you have a complicated process like this with several processes contributing to the output. If you increase the efficiency of one process, then you actually will probably use more of that process. So, for example, if I increase the efficiency, if I wanted to make, if I was making some sort of food product, and I used milk as part of that. If I increased the efficiency of buying and using milk, in order to balance this overall product formation, instead of decreasing this process, I would increase this process, use this more efficiently, end up with more profit. So increasing the efficiency often leads to an increase in the use of that component. Now, this wouldn't necessarily happen if you just had a component you just only used on its own. But when these components were increasing the efficiency of the manufacturer and bringing the price down on those, and that could be something like electricity, it could be something like milk or cheese products. Any of those things you can imagine that contribute to the formation of some other product. If you increase the efficiency of their production and drive the price down, you're actually going to increase its use. This is called the rebound effect, and it's one of those sort of second level considerations where you think, well, how could it hurt to decrease the cost of electricity? That's just making it more efficient. Well, then people just actually use more electricity. So that's the rebound effect. All right. Now I know we're going through several topics, and all of these that I'm jumping from one topic to the other, but they're all related. It goes from the two types of efficiency to optimization. Now we're talking about dynamic optimization, and in dynamic optimization, it's really what's the control logic by which you would continually adjust the ratios of process 1 and process 2. Or what are the control processes where you continually adjust how much water and land are used in agriculture, or water and fertilizer are used in agriculture. And what we're going to do is just look at this as a simple control logic. And in this case, we have A and B feeding into C. C is the product. And if the rate of A is greater than the rate of B formation, it means you have excess A. What you need to do is in the next feedback step, you have to increase the amount of B that you make. So you invest in more in this process of B. And this sort of dynamic process, if A is greater than B, you're going to have a little extra A left over, and that would signal for some amount of the overall product in a factory. That's money being generated through the economy, and in an organism, that's just the distribution of new growth. We'll go back to the process 2 and speed that up. Now, one of the things that happens is you can have this outcome for dynamic optimization can run smoothly because the machinery in processes 1 or 2 just increase steadily, and they just continue to balance each other out. Or sometimes there's a time lag between when you get the information about what is whether A or B is too high and how long it takes to reinvest. That can end up with a sawtooth effect, and this is very common where process A goes along and increases for a while, and then it's in abundance, so then it stops, it just levels off, and then process B increases for a while. And then it becomes overabundant, and then stops and goes back to A. So you're investing all in process A, or then stop and invest it all in process B. Just the regulation goes back and forth. Now, in the worst case scenario with this, when it's not matched to the environmental conditions, you can invest in process A and it increases, but then just about the time you switch over to invest in process B, the environment conditions change such that now you actually need more of A. So this is, you invest in A till there's too much of it, but then you switch over, and just about the time you switch over, you need more A. So we call this chasing your tail, is that because of the time lag, you always seem to be optimizing for the wrong parameter. And this can happen in a cyclic environment or an unpredictable environment where the organisms or the factory or whatever it is that's doing this optimization process just is receiving the cues sort of out of phase for when they need them. Okay, now, finally, we talk about, I'm going to lead into this later about talking about optimization, talking about efficiency. That's not really the goal. And here's an example, and I talked about this in Chapter 4 of the text, where you have multi-scale regulation. So often we talk about human temperature regulation as being a thermostat. If it's too hot, you cool yourself down. So, and it's just as if you have your air conditioner turned on. If it's too hot, air conditioner kicks on and goes down, and when the temperature gets low, it turns off again. But in a human system, which you're all aware of, you might not be aware of how intricate it is. There's 5 mechanisms that have overlapping timescales for controlling your body temperature, and these are they're not inherently efficient. They're all sort of overlapping each other, and that's because they can be used in many different circumstances over many different time scales to regulate your body temperature in a very narrow range. So if all of a sudden you become too warm, your skin will flush, blood will rush to your skin. If it increases for a while, you'll get a systemic increase in blood flow, more blood throughout your limbs in particular, to try to dump some of that heat. That doesn't work. You'll start sweating. Now this doesn't always follow in this order because conditioned athletes will start sweating right away, but other people, it might take them a while to start sweating. Then if you're still warm, you'll increase your breathing rate. And somewhere along here and over these time scales, if you were uncomfortable, you would just get up and move, or you might start fanning yourself, or you might unbutton your shirt or something. These are all behavioral things, so they happen at these different time scales, and they all overlap in terms of regulation to reach this goal, which is keeping the temperature of your body in a very narrow range, not necessarily to be highly efficient or optimal, but to keep your forms of regulation, that is, but to keep your body in a narrow range. Okay. Now, another problem we face when we talk about optimization is if we have 2 different objectives that we're trying to meet. So sometimes those objectives are things like increasing biodiversity versus increasing economic development. Now these can be, in a big scale, in the state of Oregon or city of Portland, something like that. So sometimes these objectives work together. So when you have objective 1 and you start adding a little bit of objective 2, the overall benefit is how far you are away from the origin here. So this would be, the green is a synergism. You can have objective 1 and you can be meeting that, and you can add lots and lots of objective 2, and you can be all the way out in this surface of optimization. There's other cases where the objective 1 and objective 2 are just straight trade-offs. You can either have this amount of parking lot, or you can have this amount of trees, and every area that you have as parking lot is just less area that you have as trees. And then Finally, there's objectives that interfere with each other. You can have, and I used this example before, you can have a bunch of people or you can have a bunch of cougars. But when you start having cougars around people, it becomes very, that decreases as objective 2 pretty quickly. And when you have a bunch of people and you just have a few cougars around, it decreases that pretty quickly. So you really just want to have these two separate. It's not really a good trade-off. They interfere with each other. So again, just trying to make a simple example. I'm not saying we should go out and kill all the cougars. I'm just saying that if you have a bunch of people around, all you need is just a few cougars, and that really decreases your overall utility, because those cougars are going to make life miserable for those people, hungry cougars. All right, so we're going to see that in environmental trade-offs, that land use, different choices of land use, sometimes they work together. Sometimes you can have certain types of parks and agriculture, and they're actually very synergistic. Sometimes it's just a linear trade-off, and sometimes there's interference. Okay, the next to the last thing I want to talk about is how efficiency and optimization remind you, these are ways to solve problems, they're not the goal. So you often hear somebody say, if all our factors are the same, blah, 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 then we should do things efficiently. And this makes a lot of sense. Like, if everything else is the same, then we should have more efficient electricity and have less carbon produced per kilowatt hour. Or we should have cars that drive more miles per gallon if everything else is the same. But we have to look at what do we mean if everything else is the same. That's very rarely the case. So we need to dig into that a little bit. And here's an example. What do we mean when we call something waste? So if I say, here's the lumber production, and we have waste along the line in lumber production. Well, if it's trees that fall to the forest floor, that's very different than sawdust that falls on the mill floor, which then can be collected and you can do something else with. And the worst case is, what if you have defective wood product that's already shipped to the consumer? That's a type of waste, and that has to be dealt with in a whole different way. So these are if you look at, here's a tree and then here's the lumber in a house, these are very different forms of waste all along the way. One promotes ecology, one could promote some sort of other industry, another is just totally useless. So we have to think about that when we try to make streamlined and highly efficient processes. What type of waste are we producing? Maybe in our regulation we're making something that's very, very sensitive to the variability in the environment and could actually, like we mentioned before, be out of phase, chasing its tail, actually be, in some situations, be worse. And then it could actually have regulations and regulation of some process that's not resilient. It won't react correctly except for just small-scale disturbances. Anything outside of that, it'll just fall apart. So, as with other environmental problems, and we're going to talk about this in the last third of the course, what we want to do before we choose a solution to a problem is understand what knowledge we have, what sort of control we have over the problem, and how values relate to that. Okay, now I just want to make a final comment on this resiliency because it relates to this regulation and optimization. When you have a forest that is like an old growth forest that's highly resilient and has been around for 10,000 years, it's really not efficient by any means of normal efficiency measurements. It's capturing all this sunlight. There's very little net growth. There's all of the energy is being consumed just within that forest itself, and it's there to maintain itself. And that's the resilience. So the resilience in this, in these fantastic systems that regulate over centuries, it takes a lot of energy, and in fact, it takes the entire ecosystem output of those old growth forests to regulate themselves. They're not there to produce trees for somebody else. They're not there to produce clean water. Those may be byproducts of their growth. But the main point of all of those overlapping regulation systems is to maintain a dynamic system that is resilient to change. So when we think about that again, when we come back and talk about these issues, and we try to use environmental metaphors for how to increase industrial production, the most finely tuned ecological systems are really those that take care of all their own waste. They're regulated over long periods of time for resiliency, and they can maintain a level of internal health that's very high. Okay, we've hit a lot of topics. I think when you see what the reading is, in particular the chapter, it's very focused on this efficiency and optimization. I think that'll help organize your thoughts. Thank you.